So today I'll be making cookies. I've got all my ingredients here. Got my granulated sugar, all-purpose flour, pure vanilla extract, baking powder and baking soda, 2 eggs, some shortening, butter, semi-sweet chocolate chips. I've got cake bread flour, milk, and then some salt. So I will be making 3 different types: thin, puffed, and in between. The difference is going to be the type of fat used in each recipe. The amounts are running very fast, but here is a rundown of the recipes. So this is my sister Isabel. We're going to start making the thin cookies. We actually have the recipe so we don't end up with 50 cookies. So we're going to begin by sifting together the flour, salt, and baking soda. So for the puffed and the in-between, I'm using baking powder instead of baking soda, and I'm also using cake flour instead of regular all-purpose flour. So we're actually using baking powder instead of baking soda because the acid will then allow the cookies to set a little bit faster, which will then cause it to spread less. It's also good at a higher temperature, so I actually temped it. I didn't record it, but it was around 80 degrees Fahrenheit at this point. So we beat together 1/2 cup of sugar and 5 tablespoons of butter, and we're going to add 1 tablespoon of milk. So we're adding 1 1/2 teaspoons of vanilla extract and mixing. Now we're going to gradually add our dry ingredients to our wet. So I temped my dough and it was around 81 degrees Fahrenheit, which is too high, so I will be putting it into the fridge while I make the rest of my dough. So now I'm going to mix together about 4 1/2 cups of shortening with my sugar, exactly 1/2 cup of sugar. Okay, and then we're going to add 1/2 of an egg, which we pre-mixed. We're going to mix the dry ingredients into our wet ingredients. The reason why I keep temping my dough is because the temperature going into the oven is pretty critical. I want it to be cooler rather than hotter so that the butter or fat will melt slower. Now I'm going to add together 2 1/2 tablespoons of shortening with 2 1/2 tablespoons of butter, and then I'm going to add 1/2 cup of sugar. So the addition of this egg is actually going to help set and minimize spread of the cookies. So the reason why we add it to the puffy and the in-between is so that the setting will happen a little bit quicker. So here is my in-between dough, and I'm going to take the temperature of it. So it's at about 80 degrees Fahrenheit as well. So I took my doughs out of the refrigerator and they are cooled to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. They're ready to go into the oven after we put it on a pan. So I think the thin is definitely going to flatten out a little bit more because of the butter, but I also think that the in-between and the puffy will have a little bit more texture because of the butter and the cake flour. So we're going to put them in for about 6 minutes and then rotate them and leave them in for another 6 minutes.
What temperature is it at?
At 375. So we have 3 different types of cookies here. As you can see, the flat cookies spread out a little bit more. That's because the butter actually melted and doesn't set the starches and the proteins. As for the puffy ones, you can tell that it's a little bit more raised. That's because it didn't use any butter and just shortening. So the shortening clearly helped the proteins and the starches set a little bit more for the puffed and the in-between. So I did use 2 different types of flour, just original all-purpose and cake flour. This did help the water availability a little bit. The cake was a little bit more moist, but since I did use just plain white cane sugar, the moisture was a little bit less. So if I were to use brown sugar, that should have been more atmospheric moisture and it should have been more texture and more moisture in that. Alright, so the cookies are done and we're going to try them. First, we're going to start with the thin. Cheers. Crunchy?
Crispy.
While the thin cookies definitely had a little bit more moisture, I thought they were a little crispy and not very flavorful. Alright, now the in-between. Cheers. I definitely thought that the in-between cookies had a little bit more moisture and flavor, and just overall was better than the other 2.
Buttery, flaky, crisp.
Can you taste the butter?
More flavor.
Yeah, so more flavor. All right, and then we're gonna do the puff. I thought that the puff was a bit dry. It was a bit flaky as well, so it wasn't fairly easy to swallow or pleasant. A little bit more dry and not as much flavor.
I like them in between the best.
I think the in between is my favorite too.
Cheers. Okay. Well, if you don't know how to make cookies, well, good luck, Charlie.